We are really, really lucky to have Jody Hoffer Gittell come and spend some time with us today in follow-up to Carol's phenomenal presentation, at which she addressed the challenges of working together in an interdisciplinary team. And I thought that was a great differentiation between a multidisciplinary and an interdisciplinary team. Jody has essentially provided the world with a set of tools to help us make that transition from working in silos, with each of us coming to a table as an individual, to how do we create high-performing teams. Jody's a professor at Brandeis. She has really made, as I said, a national, international reputation in relational coordination and how do you move to create high-performing teams. She's a member of the board of the Endowment for Health here, and knows very well the challenges we face in New Hampshire, which coming from the Midwest, where we're used to big spaces and lots of big groups, I'm always amazed at the challenges of working in with many small groups, everyone doing excellent work, but sometimes it doesn't all come together for an aggregate excellent performance. Jody's work has been in healthcare, long-term care, the airlines, education. Really, the tools that she's bringing to us really supersede any particular discipline. They really are about how do we work together and create teams. So, Jody, thank you for coming, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Sally. That's a wonderful introduction, but I feel very lucky to be here, really inspired by the work you're doing. I think this is easily the frontier of health system reform, right here, rebuilding it at the community level, and not just in our excellent medical centers, but right out into the community where health and wellness are most needed. So one way, and I can see why Sally thought Carol's presentation would be a wonderful foundation for what I have to share, because it's a perfect illustration of how you go from multi-professional to interprofessional, where there's a interconnecting and not just an additive total, but actually influencing what each other does, so that it ends up being complementary and value added. So some of the challenges that we're facing, I think we see across the country. There's a rise in chronic illness and substance use. Economic opportunities are not sufficient. And as we look at social determinants of health, there's no question we have to think about these very basic things like opportunity that could be driving any number of the other things. So we're now moving beyond traditional healthcare to address the social determinants. And as we have experienced, that requires coordination with multiple stakeholders, and in the community and in our healthcare systems. And some have little previous experience of working together, and some have had experience, but it's not always a positive history, because we do have silos that we've inherited. You know, we didn't create these silos, but we've inherited them, and now it's our opportunity and our job to overcome them. So this is one way that I tend to look at systems, and it's basically, I can see quite a few here that were mentioned by Carol, but also I overlooked housing. And as somebody who's been on not only the board of Endowment for Health, but Families First Health and Support Center in the Seacoast, housing is obviously a critical piece here. So that needs to be added. And I'm sure that's not the only one. But this is one way to kind of picture the systemic nature of the challenge that we're facing, and the systemic nature of the solutions that we're creating. And right in the middle are not just the citizens as individuals, but as members of families and communities. And I thought it was a really interesting insight that substance use is a kind of you develop a relationship with the substance that you're abusing, and so it's a kind of a relational issue itself and may need a relational solution. So I'm definitely going to be giving that some more thought. So today's just a very brief introduction to this concept, relational coordination. What is it? How does it drive performance? What kinds of performance outcomes do we know about so far? How is it currently working in our communities? Usually there are areas of strength and there are areas of opportunity. Like any process map or any mapping we do, there are areas where we're doing well and then we can learn from those. And how can we build it where it's most needed to achieve community health and wellness? That's kind of the last part. It's a kind of a 6 stages of change. And I'm hoping we have time to do a mapping to at least start to visualize how it's currently working in the communities that we're involved in. And these are the 2 industries where I've done most of the work. Started out with airlines, strangely enough, as a student many years ago at MIT, and then quickly moved into healthcare, where it seems I have not been able to leave because it's really just such a all-encompassing part of our world and our well-being. So this is what I first saw when I went to Logan Airport and started to observe. I got invited in because I knew someone at American Airlines and started to observe and do a lot of interviews to find out what people were trying to achieve and what were their frustrations in trying to achieve it. And I came to see this process, this connection across these groups that were having a lot of challenges, that relationships are basically shaping the communication through which coordination occurs. And sometimes it was happening in this really pretty high functioning ways. Across those various silos, people had separate goals, but they could see how they were connected. They not only had their own expertise, but they understood each other's work and how it connected to theirs, and they felt that their work was respected. And that tended to drive, it seems, sufficiently frequent, timely communication, because when you know what someone else is doing, it's easier to know in a crunch what they need to know and when and why. So you can be timely with your communication. You can be accurate in terms of being able to say something in a way that they're going to understand if you understand what they're doing and what they know, and then to engage in problem-solving communication when things break down, which tends to reinforce this positive cycle. But much of the time, this is what I was hearing. People felt they had strictly functional goals and didn't really have a sense of what other people's goals were. Their knowledge was within their silos and knew their own jobs extremely well, but didn't have this kind of systemic understanding that Carol was referring to, and they often felt that their work was not fully respected or appreciated. I mean, if you don't understand someone else's work, it's easy to kind of downplay its importance, and that is often what happens. And communication was therefore insufficiently frequent, delayed. It was hard to know who needed to know what and why and when, inaccurate, and when things went wrong, often a resort to finger pointing, because if you're doing your job exactly the way it's supposed to be done and something goes wrong, it's got to be their fault, right? It's because you're not thinking necessarily about the connections between what you're doing and what they're doing. So this is, the other scenario. And often people and systems are somewhere in between. It's an evolution. It can change from day to day. And we call this, I ended up calling it relational coordination. At first, I just called it cross-functional, cross-organizational, but people kept saying, this is not normally what we think of when we think of coordination. And I just defined it as communicating and relating for the purpose of task integration. Basically saying that the communication through which we coordinate is shaped by the relationships among the entities. And as you notice, it's not who likes who, it's do we share a set of goals? Do we understand each other's work? Do we respect each other's work? This is like the professional relationships that we would hope to have. And it can segue into actual friendships and so on, but this is really relationships between the roles rather than specific individuals. So I started out by studying this in flight departures and measured these outcomes that the industry really cared about. On-time performance, customer complaints, baggage handling, and efficiency performance like employee productivity and turnaround time at the gate. That was a critical one for getting costs down and keeping quality and safety high. And I measured RC using the 7 questions that were associated with those dimensions. And this is just a quick summary of the results. There are a lot of kind of regression models, but when relational coordination was higher, so was this index of quality and efficiency performance outcomes, risk adjusted for the complexity of what the airline was trying to offer. And you'll see, you had some high outliers up there. Southwest Chicago was the highest performer. They were really struggling in their LA station. And then American was still down here. And they had a lot of work to do in terms of breaking down those silos and working on their flight departure process. So, I was in the hospital around that time for the first time ever as a patient having a baby. And I'm like, this looks exactly the same, except it's more complex. What people are trying to do and the areas of expertise. And I actually had a very simple birth, but I could already see the challenges. Sometimes the coordination was great. My nurses were coming in one after the other. I know you just heard that. I wanted to build on it and give you a little bit more information. And I said, wow, you guys are really good. You've been working on your coordination. And they said, we've been doing TQM. It's going great. We're really happy with it. And then at one point I said, when's my doctor coming? Oh, we don't know. They don't tell us anything. So it's that kind of phenomena where it's easier to, it's not like a piece of cake, but it's easier to coordinate often within our areas of expertise than it is across. And not only because the professional knowledge is similar, but we're often set up to reinforce the coordination within, but not between. So that was a common thread. And I went on to study this well, first of all, people were noticing, there's a real problem in healthcare in terms of each discipline and each type of organization tends to defend its own authority at the expense of the total system's function. And that's pretty much what I was starting to see. So I studied it in a surgical setting because it was really easy to measure the outcomes, and it seemed like the coordination challenges would still be there. Looking at patient satisfaction, 2 clinical outcomes, post-surgical pain and mobility, and then also length of stay, risk adjusted. And again, measured RC in this kind of network measure that I showed up front with the 7 dimensions. And again, found that this relational coordination was highly predictive of this risk-adjusted quality efficiency performance index. And I remember sharing with an orthopedic surgeon at one point, and he said, I really understand the results. I've seen them in the literature, but it's hard for me and my colleagues to realize it's not just what we're doing on the operating table that makes a difference. Because depending on the training, we may see our job as being like the whole thing rather than being one critical element of a systemic effort. So there are clearly ways to influence where you end up here, and one of them is how we're even trained to look at our jobs. So the research has continued into a bunch of sectors, but you'll see a lot of areas of healthcare and not sufficiently yet in this whole rich arena of community health and wellness. So I think it's a huge opportunity for learning about coordination, and a lot of learning has already happened, but also in these sectors where we wouldn't normally think about coordination mattering. It turns out construction is very complex, and our colleagues in Norway and even Cleveland Clinic are doing a lot of work on how do you bring different organizations together to build major infrastructure or major building projects. As Sally alluded, it's been kind of translatable into many languages, and I think it's partly because the ideas are so simple. It's easy to understand and often not so easy to do, but the basic ideas of sharing goals and sharing knowledge and that mutual respect, it's really present in many cultures, that aspiration. And these are some of the performance outcomes. Some have come out of my research, but many of them from other people's: quality and safety outcomes, efficiency and financial outcomes. As we work more in a more coordinated way, there's often less waste involved. Instead of duplicating work, we're really reinforcing each other's work. Easier to engage with clients themselves when we're coordinated because rather than each of us coming at them from a different direction, we're kind of like a well-functioning team, and then inviting them to be part of it is easier than kind of confusing them with all these different things coming from different directions. So some of the findings here, I think, are the newest ones, I think, really interesting. And it's often that part of that patient-centered approach where the client is actually in the middle and we're all working together. And then it's also, there's these outcomes that are favorable for the people doing the work: less emotional exhaustion, less burnout, more sense of satisfaction and proficiency. as we support each other's work rather than unintentionally undermining it. So one way to look at it is in any situation we often will have a trade-off between quality outcomes and efficiency outcomes, but there's also a number of fundamental process improvements that let us shift that out so that there may still be a trade-off, but it's at a higher area of possibility called a production possibilities frontier. And any fundamental process improvement should allow us to move beyond just these trade-offs to do better on multiple dimensions. And from the evidence, it looks like RC is one of them. So I think one way to look at it, it's really, it gets back to this culture word that we started with today, that having this set of relationships helps to create a culture that actually supports not only the immediate connection and coordination of work, but also supports process improvement. Because when we can see the same problem from multiple angles because of our being in conversation with people who see a completely different perspective, we can see opportunities to improve it, exactly like the projects that we just heard about a few minutes ago. And another way to look at it is that having these kind of relationships allows people and their organizations to better visualize how we connect around the people that we're serving. It's that kind of systemic thinking once again. So I'd like to invite you at your tables, and hooray, there's already some markers and paper there, to do the following. How are we doing in different parts of the work that we're involved in on these dimensions? And one, it's called relational mapping, and it basically starts with, what's a work process that we are currently trying to coordinate that might be really challenging? And there's so many, but you could choose one that's right around the area of the E3 or the D2 or the B1 or all those vitamins that we were just talking about, or something really broad, like, community-wide, how are we building health and wellness? Choose something manageable. We won't get to completely finish it, but you'll get the idea. Which are the roles, organizations, or we call them work groups, that are involved? Sometimes it's easier to see it this way than to hear all these instructions. We draw a circle for each of them and basically put inside, this is the substance abuse center, this is our community health center in town, and so on, and then lines that connect between them. And basically the color of the circle is how well integrated or aligned are they internally around this issue, and then how well aligned or integrated are they with the other parts of the system. And some of it we just won't, it'll be hard to tell. We don't have all the right information around one table right now. But some of it might be more apparent how well groups are connected with each other currently in the current state than it is about the internal alignment around these issues. And I think Carol also said, not to over quote her, but that it's really hard to coordinate with others if you haven't done the work internally. So sometimes that's a place to start. In this case, this was the first intervention that was done using the RC framework. It was a neonatal intensive care unit, and the intensivists were really having a tough time with each other. And until they worked on that, it was very hard to branch out and repair other relationships. So that's just a little, and that was colleague Tony Suckman who did that one, and really took this from a kind of a research tool into a tool for change. So this is one way that it looks as we're putting this out. This was a top management team at a health system, and one of the insights that came from this was the CEO, and he's like looking at these lines and saying, shouldn't that red line between the radiologist and the surgeon, shouldn't that be green? And the other ones are like, yes, but it's not. So it was a way to get that visibility, but more similar to what we're doing here. This was out at UCSF, and they were looking at building a mental health system that would work for the, in the next decade for the city of San Francisco. And you can see a lot of blue and red because that's just a much bigger challenge than just running a surgical unit. So I invite you to use this as a kind of a model and take the next 20 minutes to work on this, and I'll just be walking around. Question?
Just one quick question.
Yeah.
Can you give us an example of where it doesn't, like a red circle? I think sometimes it might be easier for us to think, well, why doesn't it? Give us a bad example.
Yeah, so those intensive, it turns out that it was a highly diverse group coming from, a lot of different backgrounds, and they also had a kind of a shift mentality. They weren't working together at all. They were just kind of having these handoffs, and at the handoffs, they would just rewrite each other's notes, and it totally confused the whole staff and the patients, and so it was even erupting into shouting. That was one version of red.
Really messy. So
Tell us what the different colors mean, because we're impressed that there's no red.
No, red. There's a couple red.
oh, there's a little bit of red. So most of us at this table we're all from the Keene area, but different organizations. So we initially put our organizations in the circles, and then we identified, just based on the earlier conversation, a few other organizations like Keene Housing and local transportation as to represent social determinants. And then we started positive with green, and we were getting a fair amount of green lines. But as soon as we got into it, we were saying to amongst the table members that there's a subjectivity to the word strong or moderate or weak. But anyhow, we tried to have some common frame for that. And then we have quite a few black lines, which are the moderate. And then the weak were in part some cases where we have like a new transportation resource that's expanding into the region from the eastern side, so that was weaker in general. But what we kind of came around to talking about is when you do the colored lines, that we were fundamentally talking like organizational, and we're all people at a administrative level of our organizations that have good relationships. We're all sitting together. But that if you drew these lines by, say, IT connectivity, strong, weak, moderate, if you drew these lines by direct care staff, do they feel the same way that I feel as a hospital administrator? Or you drew it by patient and families. Is it their experience that they're working with the hospital and MFS and ServiceLink? Would they draw, red, black, green lines? So we probably have some work to do. And we would probably want to have some direct care staff and some patient family people at a bigger table to try to draw those lines, not just our small group. So it's kind of a start to thinking about this.
Yeah, and it could be that at the leadership level, things look more integrated because you're talking, but when it gets down to direct care providers trying to connect across those silos, there may be more challenge. So I think next steps are pretty, I would agree with you there. What were you thinking, Lori?
I just have a question, Sean. I'm just curious about who's at your table.
Okay, so Monadnock Family Services, our community mental health center, Cheshire Medical Center, which is both the hospital and the clinic, primary clinic stuff. Phoenix House, substance use treatment. ServiceLink, who does a lot of connectivity with everybody. Crotchet Mountain Community Services, another community-oriented agency. So those were the key groups at the table.
Yeah, there's a lot of red. Maybe just look at Lori, and then we'll just move. Yeah. They're being very revealing here.
Wow.
That's where all
Yeah.
And this is really, there are 3 of us from the Upper Valley here at this table, and then 2 home care staff members, nurses from the home care system in Keene, who contribute to the conversation from their perspective. So I just think this is an interesting contrast to your table and the experiences that you've had.
And we were looking at what the internal relational coordination was too, recognizing that in a primary care practice, for example, where we're looking at SUD treatment, there's such disparate understanding, and the relationship between the different providers is so different that we would color the actual primary care practice is red, and the same thing was true of the hospital. So before we even got to drawing the lines to the other organizations, we had
Yeah, and you can see how that might work, because if you have kind of disparate understandings and not aligned within an entity, it could be hard for you to coordinate nicely with others when you're not on the same page yourselves. And some people look at stakeholder alignment, like if you don't have your internal stakeholders aligned, it's very hard to like strike an agreement with outside parties that's truly going to be embraced by your internal. So it does suggest some interesting stages of the change process. So I mean, I'd like to just reflect, maybe summarize in the next couple of slides what a change method would look like if this gets added to kind of the work that you're already doing on a day-to-day basis. And one of the things is just to recognize all the research that is showing about half of the studies that have been done, we were just identified 69 or some number like that, did a review of the literature, but about half of them are on how RC affects a whole series of outcomes, quality, efficiency, safety, and so on. The other half are looking at, well, how do we get there? What are the structures that either help to support it or not, maybe unintentionally undermine it? And they do include some of the things we heard about this morning from Carol. Are we selecting for teamwork, or what is sometimes called relational competence? As we bring people into the organization, are we looking for that characteristic? Not just people who are working directly with clients, but more broadly. And then how do we reinforce that with our training? Have we found a way to create shared accountability rather than kind of competing accountabilities for different pieces of a problem, that I know that you're trying to achieve this, so part of my accountability is to help you get there. And often that aligns with shared rewards. Have we created some way of having aligned rewards rather than competing? Conflict resolution process, have we found a way to set one up that allows us to resolve conflicts that emerge? Because I'm a real believer in the possibility for conflict to be a very creative process, because all it really means is difference. And if you can harness that difference and make sense of it, you've got an innovation. So conflict is not just to sweep it under the rug, but to have a venue to bring it out and say, well, what does this mean? We see this 3 different ways. So I think that's developing something like that, a process like that in the IDN, I think could be useful. And then so on. Boundary spanner roles, I think, more obvious. We're seeing all these complex case managers, roles that we might create to help facilitate coordination and conversation across. And then what are the meetings that we need, and so on. But how do we really get there, I think, is a question, because when I was starting this work, I thought, well, you just create these structures and you create this new culture which drives the outcomes. But in fact, it's not such a direct process, because who's going to even be able to implement those structures if you don't already have some sense of shared goals and shared knowledge and mutual respect? You come together in a meeting, it could be a disaster, right? So it's more iterative. It's not just plopping in structures and suddenly you have this new culture. So what I've been learning from watching these change processes all around is the first step is really just to explore and really understand deeply the context, which you already know, because this is your work. What are the performance outcomes we're trying to achieve? Those have been identified in large part. And what's this work process that we're engaged in that's driving those outcomes? Who are the key stakeholders involved? I mean, every time we sit down, we probably can think of another one that we may have left off, but that might matter if we're really addressing holistically the social determinants of health. And then introducing the RC framework to those stakeholders to say, we really do have this interdependent work, and how can we do it together? And then to create a change team. I mean, you have change teams, so that's not a really new step. You're so far along in the work. But how do we motivate stakeholders from very distinct perspectives and sometimes power to contribute their time and effort to a change process? There's some who are quote unquote too busy, and yet there's some need for their voice to be included if this is going to be a successful effort. And there's going to be sensitive discussions that happen as we get into this work. So how do we create a safe space to disagree respectfully so that conflict or difference becomes a source of innovation rather than just shutting down and going home? And this relational mapping can be an interesting way to start to visualize the work to be done, the relational rather than the technical side of the work. And again, it's just a picture of doing that at the community level. Now I have more pictures to add to this going forward. But where is it currently working well? Where is it not working well? what are the underlying causes? You know, we might at least have a little bit of a sense, well, there's a whole history. I remember when I first did this with a group of engineers, you'll be surprised, it was British Petroleum, you know, I was doing an ops academy at MIT, and the first time I ever did relational mapping was them, you know, picking a big coordination challenge, like turning around an oil rig. And they'd say, well, this red line between, you know, this group and this group, it's just always been that way. We have no idea. The engineers and the workers are just never aligned. So sometimes it's just history. And where are the biggest opportunities for change, and how does it affect our performance outcomes? We may have a line that is green, but it needs to be even greener because it's such a critical connection for achieving the outcomes of interest. So to really think about not only how strong are the ties right now, but how strong do they need to be in order to get where we're going. And sometimes there could be a red tie that, well, it's not great, but it may not be a critical, the place that we would start, because it's not like on a critical path. It's something that we'll come back to. So even deciding where to approach is very much a kind of a group decision and a judgment call. So we also have a way to measure it, to get more perspectives into it, to assess it accurately and inclusively. Because I mean, you can have that same tie, you'll see in a moment, where it might be blue, but from one perspective, it's actually green, and the other perspective, it may be red, depending on whose coordination needs are being met. And it's not always the same depending on the relative power. And then the results are shared as the basis for discussion and as a starting point for improvement. So these are the 7 questions. And somebody was asking on Thursday, well, 7, I thought the survey was longer. Well, if you're asking the questions with respect to each of the, how many groups did you have on your map over there? If you had to guess?
We had about 10.
Yeah, so it would basically be 70. But there's a lot of repetition, so it's not, it doesn't, yeah. It's typically around a 20-minute survey, but to reflect on them then becomes even more important than the measurement, and that is, people call it looking into the mirror, because it's a way to see ourselves as a system, put the elephant on the table. Our colleagues in Canada sometimes call it putting the moose on the table. But a starting point for new conversations and for reflection and change. And it's in a way creating a boundary object, so it's not about, you know, this individual and that individual. You're starting to see a set of relationships that none of us created, but we now are responsible for them. And one way to look at it is, first of all, just what are the 7 dimensions? What we typically see is shared in healthcare, shared knowledge and timely communication are some of the biggest challenges. Here, problem-solving communication was also one of the biggest challenges that they were starting with. And then, of course, you can see it in this configuration. This is an inpatient setting, and interestingly, the green, the care coordinator, was not only kind of highly coordinated with themselves, but also was a source of a bunch of the other green lines. And some of the others, like, for example, RNs and physicians, that's a blue line, and sometimes that means it's, you know, an average of, yeah, in any case, it turns out if you look at the matrix behind that network, it is pretty much the same experience in both directions. The nurses are experiencing their coordination from the physicians at this level, 3.55 across them, and the physicians are experiencing their coordination with the nurses, 3.85. So it's a little bit, you know, more positive experience for the physicians with respect to the nurses than vice versa, but they're not like living in 2 different universes. So that's just an example of what's going on behind the map. And then this is looking at a small city in Massachusetts that was working on youth violence. And so here they're really focused less on the coordination within and more on the coordination between. And you can see a lot of red. When you take this to the community level and you haven't been working a lot at the community level with all of these players, there's a lot of opportunity is one way to see it. And they are engaged in interventions right now. This is the matrix behind it. So what the really, people tend to move very quickly from looking at this to saying, well, what are the interventions we need? We're already designing some of them for other challenges that we're facing, but how do we think about building some of these relationships so they're strong, not only for this project, but for everything we do going forward, right? It's a real investment. and designing what we call relational, work process, and structural interventions with input from key stakeholders. And so we have this same box as before. There could be some structures that we could implement that will help us to build this. But especially when this starts out pretty weak, it can be very helpful to start with some relational interventions, creating a safe space, actually assessing our current state, and engaging in coaching and humble inquiry that allows people to start developing trust and then these relationships. We also tend to do a lot of work process improvement, and that is a very close partner of this work as we improve the work and we improve the relationships through which we're doing the work, and then build in some of these structures. We already have shared information systems, but where are they falling short? You know, once we have these this communication started, it's easier then to go and start to repair some of these structural issues to help support what we now, the culture that we're starting to build. So just wanted to point out finally that you can also not only build coordination across partner organizations, there's a kind of a leadership that makes that more likely to happen. We call it relational leadership. More on that at another point. And then engaging with citizens and their families, that perspective, we tend to call that relational co-production because it's really recognizing the key role that's played by citizens themselves and their family members, and inviting them into the design process. And then, of course, implementing and assessing and that whole cycle of improvement. So I guess it's really your role to figure out, could this be helpful for in this effort that you're already engaged in to support and build community wellness, and what would be, if so, what would be next steps? So I'd love to just take a couple of questions, and I got to turn it back over to Sally and the agenda, because I know it's a packed one. Yes, please.
For several years in our community, we used a tool that's called the partner tool, and I don't know if you're familiar with that, but how does the partner tool, whatever that is, distinct from this relational coordination tool in terms of understanding trust and connection across organizations?
I'm not sure. I need to learn more about it. There's another tool that we're starting to use at the endowment called the FAST tool, which is a field building tool developed at Antioch. And that's kind of what's the strength of this field going forward. I think this adds more relational depth to that, but often these tools can be complements. There could be areas where they complement each other, areas where they overlap. So I think that would be a good kind of conversation to have once, what are the various tools that help us get, like IHI is doing some really good readiness work, but an area for their 100 million healthier lives. But one area that they're interested in building out a little more depth is in the quality of the relationships, which they, as well as I think everyone here, recognize as a critical driver of success. So do we get some useful is it a useful diagnostic to start conversations that can then start to change the culture in our community? Yes, please, Jeannie.
So several years ago, Jody and one of her doctoral students used this in an evaluation of our patient-centered medical home pilot that we had just wrapped up at the time. And I will tell you, it was incredibly predictive and effective in measuring how patient-centered a primary care practice was going to perform. I'm really excited to see this taken from an evaluation kind of framework into a proactive, prospective framework where we can really use it to make change. So we're all in with this.
So much fun to go from research, which is important, into really helping as much as possible that change process, because otherwise we're all in trouble. So a lot of the work, I think, a lot of the future of not to put too much pressure on this group, but the future of the health system of this country really depends on being able to make this transition from what we're pretty excellent on the inpatient, the traditional care side, but can we go out in a proactive way and build health and wellness in the community rather than just waiting for people to show up in the ED? And so that's why I'm so inspired by your work. Yes.
More a comment that I really appreciate that you're bringing this into the conversation, because I think we tend to be very focused on the electronic medical record is going to create integrated delivery networks, that if we have a shared plan of care, that will create integration. But in fact, it's relationships between real people that create integration. And so I think it's just so crucial to bear that in mind. I just appreciate this.
Yeah, and if you think about that place where there's the relational coordination and then those structures, the evidence is starting to suggest that those structures don't work very well. They don't just create the relationships, they need the relationships to work. And so it's a both and. I think it's a big aha for me. Yes, please.
So Paul, you had mentioned earlier about these being role relationships, not person relationships.
Yeah.
But can you say a little more about the separation of the person from their role?
Yeah, because we're looking at the relationships between the roles. That's really how the measurement tool is. But obviously, people are carrying out those roles and are shaping them and reshaping them every day. So I think there's some kind of dynamic between the role and the people who are carrying them out. And sometimes, if there's a role with just one or two people in it, it's very hard to separate the person from the role. And so we're very sensitive then about how you share back the results when it's not just about my group, but it's about me personally. So that's important to really honor that. I just think it's a kind of a dynamic between, there's a role relationship that we kind of inherit in terms of, I think, a doctor-nurse. It's evolved over history, but it's not just one. Then various people carry it out in different ways that then starts to maybe move it. So I guess one way of thinking about it is you can say, I'm going to carry out this traditionally adversarial role in a way that's more of a partnership. And then that's great if I do it, but if I can then turn around and embed what I'm doing into the role so other people are doing it too, that goes from just an individual to culture change. If you can take that individual action and then help to bring it back to your group so that you're transforming not just how you do things, but how others will do them going forward through selection and training and a conflict resolution process, and how we measure performance, for example, so that it's easier to work together. It's not just that one individual kind of rolling, like Sisyphus, rolling the stone up the hill every day, knowing that it's going to come down, but we're building it into the system so it's easier to work that way, and you don't have to be that one hero to turn it around. We can kind of make it the normal way in our community to work together. I do think it starts with key individuals, but then you go beyond that and embed it in the role. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Jody, thank you.
Yes,
so
thank
very
you.
much. Really appreciate it.